Judge Eleanor Hartman slammed her gavel, issuing a $50,000 fine to the defense attorney for procedural misconduct. The courtroom froze. Moments later, she realized she had just penalized JD Vance, not just a lawyer, but the sitting U.S. Senator from Ohio. The air grew heavy as whispers spread like wildfire. Why was one of the most powerful politicians in the country defending a small-town manufacturing company accused of poisoning its own community? And what did he know that no one else did? The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that made you acutely aware of your own breathing. The air was heavy, thick with anticipation, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The case had drawn national attention. A small-town manufacturing company, Rust Belt Steelworks, stood accused of environmental violations that had allegedly poisoned the local water supply. The allegations were severe: improper waste disposal, toxic chemical leaks, and a blatant disregard for federal regulations. If found guilty, the company could face billions in fines, and its CEO, a brash, self-made millionaire named Frank Delaney, could end up behind bars. At the defense table stood JD Vance, a man whose calm demeanor and sharp intellect had earned him a reputation as one of the most formidable attorneys in the Midwest. He wasn't flashy, didn't rely on theatrics, but there was something about the way he carried himself, a quiet confidence that made even the most seasoned prosecutors uneasy. Today, he was defending Rust Belt Steelworks, a company that had once employed his own family members in the small Ohio town where he grew up. For Vance, this wasn't just another case. It was personal. Across the room, Assistant U.S. Attorney Clara Hayes adjusted her glasses, her expression steely. She was a rising star in the Department of Justice, known for her relentless pursuit of corporate wrongdoers. This case was her chance to make a name for herself, and she wasn't about to let some small-town lawyer stand in her way. Judge Eleanor Hartman, a no-nonsense jurist with a reputation for running her courtroom with an iron fist, tapped her gavel once. "Ms. Hayes, you may proceed." Hayes stood, smoothing her tailored suit as she approached the jury. "Your Honor, members of the jury, the facts of this case are undeniable. Rust Belt Steelworks knowingly violated federal environmental laws, dumping toxic waste into the local water supply and endangering the lives of thousands. Evidence will show that Frank Delaney was fully aware of these actions, but chose to prioritize profits over people. This isn't just about corporate greed, it's about accountability." She turned, casting a pointed glance at Vance. "And yet the defense is prepared to argue that these actions were somehow justified. I look forward to hearing that justification." Judge Hartman turned to Vance. "Mr. Vance, do you wish to respond before we proceed with witness testimony?" Vance stood, buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate ease. "Your Honor, my name is JD Vance, and I intend to show that the prosecution's case, while compelling, is built on misinterpretations and selective framing of the law. Rust Belt Steelworks operated within the bounds of the law, and any suggestion otherwise is a mischaracterization." Hayes let out a sharp exhale, shaking her head. "Your Honor, we're not here to entertain semantics. The evidence is overwhelming. I have expert witnesses prepared to testify on the direct impact of Rust Belt Steelworks misconduct. Their testimonies will confirm that these practices were both illegal and harmful." Vance tilted his head slightly. "With all due respect, Ms. Hayes, intent matters. Application of the law matters. You can line up all the witnesses you want, but if Rust Belt Steelworks operated within legal boundaries, even if you find their actions distasteful, that does not make them criminals." A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Judge Hartman raised her hand to silence them. "This is not the time for grandstanding, Mr. Vance. Stick to the facts." Vance simply nodded, returning to his seat. But the tension in the room had shifted ever so slightly. Something about this man was off, and Judge Hartman couldn't quite put her finger on it. Hayes called her first witness, Dr. Emily Carter, an environmental scientist who had conducted an independent analysis of the water supply near Rust Belt Steelworks. Carter's testimony was damning. She detailed the high levels of toxic chemicals found in the water, linking them directly to the company's waste disposal practices. "These chemicals are known carcinogens," Carter said, her voice steady. "Long-term exposure can lead to severe health issues, including cancer, organ failure, and developmental problems in children." Hayes turned to the jury, letting the weight of those words settle. "Your witness, Mr. Vance." Vance stood, approaching the witness stand with a measured pace. "Dr. Carter, you mentioned that Rust Belt Steelworks' waste disposal practices led to toxic chemicals in the water. Can you specify which federal regulations were violated?" Carter hesitated. "Well, under the Clean Water Act, companies are required to properly treat and dispose of hazardous waste. Rust Belt Steelworks failed to meet those standards." Vance nodded. "And is it true that the Clean Water Act allows for certain exemptions for companies operating in rural areas?" Carter shifted slightly. "Yes, but those exemptions are limited." "Limited, but not non-existent," Vance said, turning to the jury. "So, if Rust Belt Steelworks operated within those exemptions, would you still consider their actions illegal?" Carter paused. "That's for the court to decide." Vance gave a small nod. "Exactly. No further questions." Hayes called her next witness, Sarah Mitchell, a former employee of Rust Belt Steelworks. Mitchell's testimony was emotional. She spoke of how she had raised concerns about the company's practices, only to be ignored and eventually fired. "I tried to do the right thing," Mitchell said, her voice trembling. "But they didn't care. They just kept dumping, kept cutting corners." Vance stood for cross-examination. "Ms. Mitchell, you mentioned that you raised concerns about the company's practices. Did you ever report these concerns to federal agencies?" Mitchell hesitated. "No." "So, to summarize, you found their practices questionable, but not illegal. You didn't report them, and now you're testifying against your former employer because you feel wronged. Is that correct?" Mitchell swallowed hard. "It's not just about me. It's about what they did to the community." Vance held her gaze for a moment before stepping back. No further questions. As the trial progressed, Vance systematically dismantled the prosecution's case, not by denying the harm caused, but by questioning whether Rust Belt Steelworks had actually broken the law. His calm, methodical approach left Hayes increasingly frustrated. In her closing argument, Hayes pleaded with the jury, "This isn't just about regulations or loopholes. This is about people, real people who have suffered because of Rust Belt Steelworks' actions. If we don't hold them accountable, who will?" Vance, in his closing, took a different tack. "This case isn't about whether Rust Belt Steelworks acted ethically. It's about whether they broke the law. And if the law is flawed, it's not the job of this court to rewrite it. That's the job of Congress." The jury deliberated for hours before returning with their verdict: not guilty. The courtroom erupted in a mix of gasps and murmurs. Hayes sat in stunned silence while Vance remained calm, as if he had expected this outcome all along. As the room emptied, Hayes approached Vance. "You knew you were going to win, didn't you?" Vance turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I knew the law was on my side." Hayes shook her head, half in frustration, half in reluctant admiration. "You didn't take this case to defend Rust Belt Steelworks. You took it to prove a point." Vance gave a small nod. "Maybe I did, but the point needed to be made. The case left a lasting impact, not just on the community, but on the legal system itself. It raised difficult questions about the balance between ethics and legality, and whether the law was equipped to handle the complexities of modern industry. For JD Vance, it was a reminder of why he had become a lawyer in the first place. To fight for the underdog even when the odds were stacked against them. What do you think? Should companies be held accountable for unethical actions, even if they aren't illegal? Or is it up to lawmakers to close the loopholes? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that make you think.